We've been talking about the use of alcohol in the scriptures because there are a lot of mistaken notions about it. And what we are been doing is going through the Old Testament and looking at it. And today we're going to start looking at the New Testament. For years, people argued that the ancients didn't have any methods of preserving grape juice. And so the reason why the drinking of alcohol was so prevalent is because that was basically the only way to store it. And so it was bound to become alcoholic. And the actual truth is that without a controlled environment, spoiled grape juice tends to become vinegar. Now, I've been talking with a friend who's a microbiologist, and he tells me, no, it takes a little more effort than that to make real vinegar. But it's still the truth. If you don't do much with grape juice and just leave it, it spoils. And it becomes a vinegar. It becomes acidic in the process of it. But the ancients actually had three methods of preserving grape juice. And we don't often think about it because we think of all our modern technology. We think, well, you know, we're the ones that figured out all the sophisticated things. We have already mentioned one because we looked at in the Hebrew word, there's a Hebrew word for one of the preservation methods, and that was sobe. Sobe referred to boiling juice down to the consistency of syrup. The Greeks understood this as well. In fact, Hermann Boerhaave, in the Elements of Chemistry, said by boiling the juice of the richest grapes lose all its aptitude for fermentation and may afterwards be preserved for years without undergoing any further change. And we understand that. We use a product that we call honey. We don't have to put that in the refrigerator. You can leave it on the shelf and it doesn't spoil because it's so rich in sugar that nothing basically lives in it. Columbia in the first century said it was common in Italy and in Greece to boil wine. And they're not talking about just making a hot drink out of it. They're talking about boiling it down to a syrup. Pliny in 62 AD wrote that after 2 centuries of production, opium wine had the consistency of honey. So he actually refers to a wine from opium, or opium wine, and he says it's thick like honey. How do you get grape juice that thick? You have to boil it down. Virgil, who lived 70 to 19 BC, said to make wine keep, they boiled the juice down to 1/2 to 1/3 its volume. We do that today. How many's taken a can of frozen orange juice or frozen grape juice? What do? You put 1 can in and then 3 cans of water, right? Because it's boiled down to 1/3 its consistency, or 1/4 in that case. So we do about basically the same thing. In fact, even the Jewish Mishnah teaches the Jews to water down their wine because they commonly kept it in syrup form. They weren't talking about making it so thin that you could, it's so just kind of grape flavor. They're talking about reconstituting the boiled down wine in their sense of the sobe, the syrup form. In fact, there are records giving the instruction for reconstituting the syrup depending on the kind of wine being used. Hesiod in the 8th century BC, so we're talking about 700 years before Christ, said that in the summer months, 1 part wine to 3 parts water was the correct amount. Hippocrates, the famous doctor guy, 460 BC, 377, said to use 1 part Thracian wine to 20 parts water. I think that they must really boil that down thick, or it's with really strong grapes, one of the two. But he suggested 20 parts water to 1 part wine. Some regions built places where citizens could get hot, cold, or lukewarm water. to mix with their wine, depending on the drink they desired. And they were called thermopolians. Pompeii was a place that got a volcano nearby that erupted, buried the entire city almost instantly. And it's recently been excavated and found, and they found these thermopolians. They have these places where you can just basically central water fountains. And you can go up there and you say, I want the hot drink, I want the cold water, or I want the one in between. And then you use that for the mixing of your drinks. Now, I don't know what hot grape juice tastes like. Doesn't sound very appealing to me, but obviously people did drink it that way in the past. That's just one way, though. They also had the idea that you could filter out the stuff that makes grape juice change. Gluten, or the yeast inside the grapes, was separated from the juice. Because without gluten, fermentation can't take place. In fact, Plutarch in 46 to 120 AD said, wine is rendered feeble in strength when it is frequently filtered. The strength or spirit is thus excluded, and the wine neither inflames the brain nor infests the minds and passions, and is much more pleasant to drink. So in other words, what they did was they took cloth and they filtered it over and over and over again to extract all the gluten out of it, and what was left was something that wouldn't change readily, wouldn't spoil. Pliny in 62, 133 AD said the most useful wine, it was one with all its force or strength broken by filtering. See, and if I want you to notice also something when I'm reading these quotes from the old ancient people, they actually enjoyed finding wines that didn't turn. Because that was the problem they had back then. They didn't have refrigerators in every home. And so they're talking about how to preserve it so that it didn't change. But they actually did have refrigeration back then. We just don't think about it. See, juice kept at 45 degrees or less cannot ferment. And if the juice is kept cold for a period of time, that gluten that causes the change settles to the bottom of the container. And then the juice can be skimmed off the top, and it will not ferment even when it's warmed up again. So Pliny again describes a wine that's called egelis, which means always sweet in Greek. They plunge the cask immediately after they are filled from the vat into water until winter has passed away and the wine has acquired the habit of being cold. See, they're trying to describe something that we understand. It was, yeast in the liquid that causes it changing over, but they didn't have a way to describe that. You didn't have microscopes to look at yeast and stuff like that. So he's just saying it didn't turn. It had a habit of change, staying cold, even when you warmed it up again. All they did was they plunged it in lakes. Because when you harvest grapes just before winter, sink a bunch of containers at the bottom of the lake, because lakes don't totally freeze over. The bottom stays a little warmer. And then you can pull it up in the springtime and you got grape juice. They'll last for a long time. Marcus Pontus Cato, who lived at 234 to 149 BC, said, if you wish to have must all year, put grape juice in an amphora, seal the cork with pitch, and sink it in a fish pond. After 30 days, take it out, and it will be grape juice for a whole year. So they knew how to keep grape juice from spoiling or turning alcoholic. In fact, the Jews poured a small amount of oil on the top of the juice, placed in caves. That was another way to keep it cold for this period of time. The oil produced an airtight seal. The cool caves allowed a large quantity of juice to be stored and then sold at later times of the year. This is how they did it. And if you look at the Jewish territory, we had the history and geography of the Bible, they had quite a few caves. put a bunch of juice deep in the deep parts of the cave where it stays cold, and you can bring it out anytime later in the year and still have grape juice. Now, all these various methods, when you boil something, obviously the flavor changes a little bit. You filter something, the flavor changes a little bit. Store it for a long period of time, yeah, it's still not going to be as good as a fresh grape juice, but it's still drinkable. But records consistently indicate that the best wines were considered to be the freshest, unfermented juice, even by the Gentiles. Some of these people I'm quoting from were Greek and Roman people. And that's what we're going to continue with our study in the New Testament today. Because one of the greatest difficulties when you're studying God's Word is that we have people that have biases. And when you're trying to translate from one language into another, it's hard sometimes not to let your bias show. And this is one case where it comes through. Because we already seen in the Old Testament the word wine is used to describe a lot of words where you just read the context. And we did. We went through a lot of different verses. And you read the context of some of those words and you say, this, it talks about wine being in the clusters. I don't know where you can grow grapes and get alcoholic drinks out of, by eating them. Or it talks about wine being freshly foaming from the vat right out, out of the vat. No, that's talking about grape juice. The thing is, though, the Hebrew had words for that. They also had a general purpose word called yayin for any grape product. But they had various words to describe different states of grape juice. But the problem we have is the translators decided to translate the vast majority of them all to wine. I had somebody ask me that. Why do they do that? Well, one is kind of easier. You don't have to worry about reading the context and trying to figure out were they talking about alcohol or not talking about alcohol, and trying to figure out whether wine was the appropriate case or not. But the other problem they have is that once something gets translated in the English language and people accept it, it is very hard for a new edition to change it. And just to give you an illustration, there's a word that's in our Bibles that we have a perfectly good English word for it, but we use a transliterated Greek word for it, and it's called baptized. The word means immerse. Have you ever wondered why no one in one of these modern translations just put the word immersed in there? And the answer is because way back then, when they first started translating English, they weren't practicing exclusively immersion. In fact, most people were sprinkling or pouring. And so they didn't want to get into a controversy over the meaning of that word, so they just transliterated the Greek word over to avoid the controversy. And when somebody else picked up the translation, they wanted to make a new translation. Well, the old one had it with baptized. So they just kept the word. And the next one comes along, well, all these other ones use baptized, so we'll keep that word. And they just have it. Even though there's a perfectly good English word called immerse that could have been put in its place,